My fiance secretly invited my estranged twin who once attacked me, to our wedding. It was the last straw in our relationship. 28 and I got engaged to my girlfriend of 3 years, a 26F, a few months back. We were supposed to get married 2 days ago. My girlfriend had always seemed like a normal and pretty laid-back person before we got engaged, but as soon as she got the ring on her finger, she became this controlling and stubborn person who wouldn't listen to anything I said. She planned the entire wedding and didn't take any of my opinions into consideration. She did whatever she pleased. She invited whoever she wanted to, including old friends of mine whom I hadn't spoken to in ages. I told her several times not to invite them since it would just be awkward for everyone involved, but she was convinced that everyone who'd ever known me needed to be invited. Eventually, I gave up trying and let her do whatever she wanted, hoping that this new side of hers would go back into hiding once we got married. She'd always had control issues, even before I met her. That's what my friend told me when he introduced us. But I hadn't imagined it could be this bad. She needed to be the one running the show at all times, and everything she said had to happen, or else she'd lose her mind. I dealt with it for the few weeks leading up to the wedding without a word because I did love her. But then she did something absolutely unforgivable. While we were making a list of people to invite a few months ago, my fiancé had asked me about my sister. I was a little shocked because I had told her very clearly, a few months into our relationship, that I'd gone no contact with my sister 10 years ago and hadn't heard from her since, and that's how I wanted it to stay. She met my family 6 months into the relationship, and when she saw multiple family photos on the walls, of course, she asked me who the identical girl standing beside me was in all my childhood photos. I told her about my estranged sister, my twin sister, also 28. My sister and I went no contact 10 years ago over an incident that changed my life for the worse. Growing up, my sister and I weren't friends. The photos of us as kids might mislead people into thinking we were close since we looked like two happy kids constantly hugging and smiling. But that was only for our parents' sake. Behind the scenes, we were constantly at odds over every little thing. It wasn't the usual sibling rivalry, we didn't love each other deep down. We straight up hated each other and tried our very best to one-up each other all the time. This didn't stop until high school, when I ended up scoring better than her on my SATs. She was furious and refused to even look at me for days after, which was fine by me. I thought I'd beaten her once and for all. Little did I know the worst was yet to come. A few weeks later, it was time to see what colleges we'd been accepted into. Both my sister and I were straight A students, so we expected to get accepted into all the colleges we applied to. My first choice was Yale, and hers was Princeton. I hadn't considered applying to Princeton simply because I didn't want to end up at the same place as her. But my friends convinced me to apply at the last minute, saying I couldn't base decisions about my future on something as petty as whether my sister would be going to the same place. They were right, it was about time we let go of this rivalry. So, I applied to Princeton, but I kept quiet about it because I'd made such a big deal out of not applying and even rubbed it in her face at dinner. I also found out that my sister hadn't applied to Yale for similar reasons, probably to get back at me. Anyway, I ended up getting accepted to both, while my sister was accepted to Columbia but didn't get into Princeton. It was a huge blow for her since she'd talked about nothing else but going to Princeton ever since senior year started. I knew things would only get worse once she found out I'd been accepted to Princeton, and I was right. I planned on keeping my acceptance to Princeton a secret because I wasn't going to go, and my sister didn't need to know. I didn't want any extra drama before I left for college. But I guess my parents found out somehow, they probably went through our mail. Anyway, my mom decided to throw us both a surprise party that very afternoon, with the names of all the colleges written in frosting on our cakes. I didn't know about it. If I had, maybe I could have prevented what happened. As soon as my sister saw Princeton on my cake, she scoffed and said I hadn't even applied. But I think she could tell from my face what the truth was. She started screaming in my face about how I'd ruined her life and stolen her future. I tried to explain that I had no idea she wouldn't get accepted and didn't mean to hurt her, but of course, given our history, that was hard to believe. I did feel bad about it, though. Update. After a while, she ran out of steam and stormed out of the house in tears. I sat in the living room while my parents told me how tired they were of our constant fighting and that both of us had some serious growing up to do. I couldn't blame them. They'd tried their very best to mend things between us, but we just seemed to have come out of the womb hating each other, so they'd given up and just let us do our own thing once we were in high school. I decided to take my parents' advice and try to be civil to her. So, minutes after she left, I went out to talk to her. Most of our guests had left after her outburst, and it was pretty dark outside. I couldn't see her out there and tried calling her name, but before I knew what was happening, I felt something really hard hit the back of my head, and I collapsed to the ground. The last thing I remember was being in excruciating pain and screaming for help before passing out. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital room with my wrist in a bandage. Once I woke up, my parents informed me that my psycho sister had been waiting outside for me. When I called out her name, she hit me in the head with a freaking shovel and then, for good measure, stepped on my left wrist as hard as she could, which is why it was dislocated. I could hardly even believe what they were saying because, while I'd had my fair share of differences with my sister, I couldn't imagine doing something so psychotic and depraved to her, or to anyone, for that matter. My parents begged me not to press charges against my own sister, which is why I let it go, but after that, I never saw my sister again or even asked my parents about her. I don't know what college she went to or where she went after that incident. My parents sent her away, and I never asked where. I knew they still kept in touch with her since they'd go away on weekends, never mentioning who they were going to visit, but I wasn't a fool. I knew they were going to see my sister. I never held it against them, as it was probably their best bet to keep us apart since we clearly brought out the worst in each other. After I recovered and was deemed fit by the doctors, I started college, but since I'd missed a few weeks, I was way behind in my grades. That semester was disappointing for me. On top of that, I frequently got migraines due to the head injury, and the lump at the back of my head was a constant reminder of what my sister had done to me in a fit of rage. Needless to say, I was emotionally disturbed that year and needed therapy to feel like myself again. It's been years since then, and I've moved on with my life. Now, my parents and I never talk about my sister, and no one in the family does either. I'm sure they still keep in touch with her but have the good sense not to bring her up around me. So, when my fiancé asked about her, I told her we weren't inviting her and assumed that would be the end of the discussion. I never told her exactly what had happened, and to be very honest, I don't think I should have too. Just the fact that we haven't spoken in over 10 years should be reason enough for her to understand that I absolutely don't want my sister around, not now and not ever again. She should have respected that, but she started hounding me and didn't stop for days until I snapped at her, telling her that if she brought my sister up again, I'd call off the whole wedding. That seemed to shut her up for a while. But then, 2 days ago, on our wedding day, I realized what she'd done behind my back. As I was standing up in front of the minister, waiting for my fiancé to walk down the aisle, the music started, and the bridesmaids began walking. That's when I noticed my sister among them, walking arm in arm with one of my friends, who looked as confused as I felt. Even my sister looked really lost. I was speechless for a few seconds and had absolutely no idea what was happening. My fiancé finally walked down the aisle, looking really happy and smiling widely, but I didn't feel anything except anger and betrayal. I knew this was her doing and couldn't believe she'd pulled something like this, and on our wedding day, no less. I felt completely blindsided, so of course, I didn't feel particularly emotional, and most of my guests could understand why I had an awful look on my face as my bride walked down the aisle toward me. When she finally stood across from me, still sporting that smile, I didn't waste a second and asked her why my sister was there when I'd categorically told her not to invite her under any circumstances. She told me that she didn't want to have that discussion and wanted to get married first, but obviously, that was not going to happen, not anymore. So I told her that we needed to talk about it right then. She admitted that she had told my parents I'd been talking about wanting to reconcile with my sister before getting married, which was how she'd managed to persuade them to give her my sister's address and contact info. She told me she'd worked really hard to convince them just so she could surprise me and even had the audacity to say she thought it was time for us to make peace with our past, even though she had no idea what had actually happened years ago. We argued back and forth for minutes while our guests waited. Finally, I realized there was no point in fighting for our relationship anymore. I was done and didn't want anything to do with her, so I walked out of the wedding. I could hear her calling for me to come back, but I ignored it and continued walking until I reached my car. Then, I started driving and kept going until sunset. Since I couldn't find any decent hotels around, I decided to sleep in my car. That evening, I canceled everything on my phone and ignored all the calls and messages from my fiancé and family on purpose. Thankfully, I had enough gas to get back home the next day, but as soon as I saw my fiancé's car in the driveway, I decided to stay at a hotel instead. It's been days, and I haven't responded to any of my fiancé's calls or texts. My parents have also tried to reach me, but I can't bother with them right now. Honestly, I can't even believe they were naive enough to think I'd suggest reconciling with my sister and that they fell for my fiancé's lie. The least they could have done was call to confirm if this was what I wanted, but they chose to believe this was the kind of surprise I'd want at my wedding. Most of all, I'm beyond furious with my fiancé because of what she did. She had absolutely no right to go behind my back, manipulate my parents, and bring my sister, whom I'd been no contact with for years, to our wedding. She created a royal mess of things that wouldn't have happened if she just respected what I'd said. A few hours ago, she sent me a really long text saying she'd only found out what had really happened all those years ago from my parents yesterday, after I walked out of the wedding. She apologized for blindsiding me and agreed that she should have listened when I said I didn't want my sister at our wedding. She also mentioned that my parents and friends were livid at her for doing this and that she'd received an earful from all of them. But she also added that she thought I should have explained the specifics of my great fallout with my sister and given the exact reason why I didn't speak to her anymore so that she wouldn't have invited her. I don't agree with that in the least. Sure, maybe that would have helped, but I shouldn't have to spell everything out. It was a painful memory for me, and I don't like talking about it. Besides, she should have just believed me when I told her that I didn't want my sister anywhere near me. No one just cuts off their sister for years without a valid reason, and she should have known that. It was a horrible time for me, and maybe, someday, I would have told her, but until then, she could have just taken my word for it. I'm not getting married to her anymore, that's for sure, but I don't know if I owe her an apology either. I don't feel particularly sorry about it, and if anything, she should be the one apologizing without blaming me. So, what do you guys think? Ida for not telling my fiancé exactly why I cut my sister off all those years ago? Been living in the hotel for days now. I posted my question yesterday, and I guess I was right not to apologize, so I'm back to ignoring her. I did speak to my mom this morning, though. It was weird and strained, but she told me that she was terribly sorry for what happened and that she should have known I'd never want my sister around. She explained that my fiancé had gotten in touch with them weeks ago and had spent weeks convincing them before they agreed to give out my sister's information. My fiancé had also forced them into promising not to speak to me about it since she wanted it to be a surprise, and in hindsight, they agree it was a stupid decision. I'm glad they realized that now and apologized, though I'm not sure if I'm ready to forgive them yet, as I'm pretty torn about my feelings. Eventually, I guess I will forgive them, just not now. I'm planning to go back home in a few days, but I have to make sure my fiancée isn't there when I return. She'll be the one moving out since the house is actually mine. I'll give her enough time to pack up and leave, which is more than she deserves anyway. This relationship is definitely over, and I'm honestly just relieved. Update 2. I told my fiancée a few days ago that she needed to vacate the house as soon as possible and gave her 5 days to do it. Today is the 6th day, and I went back to my house, believing she'd be gone by now since she had texted me saying she'd move out by today. So, I went back home, and to my surprise, I found her waiting for me in the living room. Very cleverly, she had probably parked her car somewhere else so I'd think she wasn't there anymore, and I fell for it. I was really annoyed to see her there and told her that I wasn't in the mood to discuss anything with her right now. True to character, my fiancée didn't pay any attention to what I was saying and started rambling about how she'd been worried sick for the past few days and that I should have at least told her where I was. I don't know why, but for some reason, my fiancée assumed that despite everything that happened, we could just resume our relationship and continue from where we'd left off, as if she'd just paused a game or something. When I didn't respond, she continued talking and told me it was really messed up that I didn't let her in on the whole situation with my sister and accused me of withholding information from her that could have put her in harm's way since she'd gone to visit my sister. That's when I lost it. I couldn't believe she had the audacity to pretend this was my fault. So, I told her bluntly to get the hell out of my house that minute and that we were over. She seemed a little taken aback. I guess she'd been taking everything I said lightly and didn't see this coming. She tried to argue and looked ready to cry, but tears weren't going to affect me anymore. I told her she needed to leave that second because I couldn't stand the sight of her, and the sound of her voice was driving me nuts. I just couldn't take her nonsense anymore and wanted her to leave for good. I must have struck a nerve there because she burst into tears, but I was so emotionally exhausted that I didn't bother consoling her. I just left her crying in the living room while I went into my bedroom and locked myself in to take a nap. I must have been asleep for a while because when I woke up, it was dark outside, and my fiancée was gone. I know she'll come back later to take her things, but for now, I'm finally on my own and have some space to think and process everything that's happened this week. Update 3. It's been days since my fiancée left, but she hasn't accepted that we're over and has been calling me every day. I'm not answering any of her calls, but I do feel a little sorry for her. As for my parents, they dropped by yesterday and apologized profusely for everything that happened, taking all the blame upon themselves. I finally asked them what my sister had been up to all these years, and they told me that after the incident, they sent her to an anger management rehabilitation center, where she spent several months in treatment and intensive therapy since her mental issues were clearly more severe than mine. Once she was cleared, she finally started college but rented an apartment and lived by herself, with my parents visiting her on weekends. She seemed a lot more normal and stable after that and even started working around the same time as me. For the past few years, she'd been living a little out of town and running her own business, which was nice, I guess. They also told me that after I walked out of the wedding, my sister seemed to realize she'd caused this and left immediately after apologizing to our parents for showing up. Apparently, my fiancé had told her it was just a rehearsal, not the actual wedding, but it all seemed pretty real to her, which is why she looked so confused. My parents also handed me a letter that my sister had written, and after they left, I finally opened it and read it. It's been an hour since then, and I'm still shattered by it. She'd apologized for everything she put me through when we were kids and then as teens, promising that she'd changed. Her words were full of regret about how we could have been the best of friends but are just bitter strangers now. She said that while she didn't hold out much hope to reconcile anytime soon because of her violent streak, she wished I'd forgive her someday and that we'd have a real chance to be the kind of siblings people would want us to be. I teared up reading that, and I guess I want the same thing. I'll give myself some time to think about it, and maybe, if I feel ready, I'll forgive her someday since I was pretty cruel to her as a child too. For now, I just want to rebuild my life and focus on improving my mental state, as the past few months have really taken a toll on me. Honestly, I'm just waiting for my fiancée to come and take back her things so I can block her and move on with my life once and for all. I think I've had enough drama for a lifetime, and I'm just done.